day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's webcast, Deconstructing Conflict, How to Understand and Manage Family Conflict Over Business, Wealth, and Power. All lines have been placed on a listen-only mode, and the floor will be open for questions and comments following the presentation. If you would like to ask a question during the webcast, you may do so by clicking on the Ask Question button located below the presentation. Simply type your question into the box and hit send. At this time, it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to Barbara Spector. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dagmar. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. Our program today will help you understand conflict so that you will be better able to manage it. Before we begin, I'd like to run through a couple of administrative points. This is a 60-minute program. As you've just heard, you'll be able to ask questions during and after the presentation by following the prompts to enter the questions from your computer. And the presentation and supporting materials will be emailed to all participants after the webinar so you can follow up. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Doug Baumoel is the founding partner, and Blair Trippe is the managing partner at Continuity Family Business Consulting, a firm whose specialties include conflict management, corporate and family governance, and organizational development. They are the authors of the new book, Deconstructing Conflict, Understanding Family Business, Shared Wealth, and Power. We're all very interested in learning more about this topic, so I feel completely unconflicted about turning the floor over to Doug.
Well, thank you, Barbara. So welcome, everyone, and thank you all for coming today. My name is Doug Baumoel.
And I'm Blair Trippe. Hello, everyone.
And we're, as Barbara said, we are the partners, and we are the authors of the book, Deconstructing Conflict. So this is our agenda today, and it's our hope and our intention for you to leave this webinar with a much deeper understanding of why the potential for conflict is so high in family enterprise. But more than that, to give you some skills and frameworks to manage that type of conflict. So we're going to begin with a very sort of high-level perspective. Let's see if these slides work. Yes, they do. So no matter what role you play, and I know there are a lot of listeners out there from a variety of different roles in your family business or enterprise, and it's important to understand that whatever your role, whether you're an in-law that is not in the business, for example, a rising generation planning to be in the business one day, or the president of the company, you have one job, and that job is to be the best stakeholder you can, to understand the resources that you can influence, and to do that in a way that advances the opportunities and manages the risks for the entire stakeholder group.
So drilling down on what Doug's meaning on that graphic is, at the center you have the stakeholder. But for each of you as a stakeholder, you bring with you your individual goals and your values and the kind of influence that you have on the organization. As Doug said, you're looking to try to figure out how, in fact, you can use the resources that are available to you. So the history that you bring with you, the family bond that you feel is going to have an influence on that. And when we talk about the resources, we're thinking about the kinds of family capital that you might have. If you have a philanthropic organization, that's something that you could leverage. Other wealth, social capital. These are all the sorts of things that you have in addition to, if you have an operating company, what the business brings to bear. And so as a stakeholder, you're looking at all of those resources, thinking about how do you leverage the opportunities that come from those resources? How do you manage the risks that come from those resources? And you break it out and you broaden it out to the wider environment, the political situation perhaps that might have an influence, the economy, the kind of industry you're in, the technology that may be coming in or may be being disruptive, the legal or regulatory or environmental regulations that you're playing in. So again, all of these things are brought to bear on how you as a stakeholder are going to interface with your particular operation. And with that, it's important to note that conflict is absolutely built into this system. It's inherent in the family business system, basically because all of the stakeholders are coming from a different point. As I said, each of you has your own individual goals and interests and values, and these may be in conflict, and we're going to go into greater detail on that. But essentially, stakeholders will value different things or want different things, and they see things differently. They have a different perspective on what's important, what's at play, and what affects other moving parts.
Right. So why is conflict built in? And by the way, I can see that our slides are building automatically instead of by our clicking. So that's going to be a little confusing, I think, in some other slides. So we'll deal with that when we get there. But so conflict is built into these systems. So what Blair was talking about was the potential for non-alignment in some of the activity in the business. But non-alignment is not the same thing as conflict. Conflict occurs when stakeholders are interdependent, when they depend on each other. And family business systems are the one type of business organization that has by far the highest degree of interdependence. Families are interdependent. When they work together, they're interdependent emotionally, professionally, economically, socially, legally, generationally, through their legacy and their reputation. And wherever you have high degrees of interdependence, you have the higher potential for conflict. And because of the very high degree of interdependence among stakeholders in a family business, managing conflict, we believe, becomes the key challenge, the most critical success factor for family businesses. We can understand this, and this is a slide that will probably build automatically, unfortunately. Let's see what it does. Yeah, there you go. Unfortunately, it builds automatically. But the first build was Tom Hanks on the alone on the Castaway Island. To make the point that when you're alone, when you're by yourself, there's nobody with whom you're going to have a values clash with. There's nobody with whom you're going to compete for resources. There's nobody with whom you have a difficult history with, where there are grudges and difficult histories at play. And there's nobody to exert power over you in any way. But as soon as you add people to that island, there's going to be competition for resources, there's going to be values clash, etc. And those are the same dynamics that play out in the family business, where you have these very high degrees of interdependence.
And so if you think about interdependence, my guess is that you all have seen the three-circle model before, where you have the Venn diagram, and that's a good place to start when you think about overlapping roles and boundaries and the kinds of influence that people have over different systems. You'll have basic conflict if you have, or basic potential for conflict, if somebody's in the business and they're really looking to grow the business and have reinvestment for growth or have high salaries or good perks, loyalty programs for their employees, versus another stakeholder who's not working in the business but rather is an owner and is much more interested in getting dividends, a regular distribution so that they can pay their tuition. So if you think about the three-circle model as the basis of it, and you build on top of it the other systems that really are at play, you think about, you have a governance system. Clearly, the directors have different obligations, different concerns and motivations than maybe just a family member might have. You also are contending with the environment in which this family business sits. So are there regulators? Are there lenders? Are there borrowers? Are there customers? What sort of competition is out there? Maybe acquisition targets. It adds a level of complexity that is really important as you're thinking about what each of the stakeholders is trying to manage, thinking back to the resources that they have at their fingertips and the risks and opportunities they're trying to take advantage of or minimize.
So, Blair, if I could interject, the three-circle model that a lot of our audience is familiar with, that's really just a simplification of what's actually going on in the system. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's exactly. And it's a great place to start, although it's sort of a simplification of the reality of what's going on.
And it's important to understand that it is a simplification. Any model is a simplification of a real-world situation. And the danger is that because that the three-circle model is so prevalent, the danger is that people assume that that's all there is, and they're not attuned to the greater complexity that really exists.
So, for example, if you look at, we have a couple circles, one in the ownership system and one in the governance system, where you have trustees. If you can imagine a trustee who is sitting on a board of directors, but also is a fiduciary to one particular beneficiary, it's very unclear who his or her loyalty is due to first. Is he or she supposed to be really focusing on all of the shareholders, as your typical director would be, or is he or she really supposed to be managing the interests of his or her specific beneficiary? And so that sets up a conflict in that one person, but then also can become systemic as it goes through. So when we think about these systems and we think, how do you look at what's really going on? We look at each family business that we work with and identify who are the stakeholders, where do they sit, and as Doug was talking about the interdependence, as you have more people bunched up in those overlaps in the center, that's going to show you that there is a higher potential for conflict. And the arrows that we have moving people around really shows that we understand this is a dynamic system. It is not just a snapshot in time, but rather it's going to keep evolving over time. And some stakeholders are going to move from one system to another. They may take additional responsibility. They may give up certain responsibilities. And it's important to understand, again, the motivations and concerns that they have, because that will really impact how they work with each other and what they're trying to accomplish on their own.
Okay, so just to sum up a little bit, we've talked about why conflict is built in. Really, what we say is it's woven into the very fabric of the family business system, because it's a complicated system, a complex system with a lot of moving parts, and the stakeholders are highly interdependent. So now let's drill down on, well, what makes family business conflict unique? What makes it different than other kinds of conflicts, thereby demanding a different approach to its management? And to start with, and again, this is going to be an automatic build, unfortunately, conflict can be active, and we all know what that looks like. Active conflict is when family members or family members and non-family members are battling it out. But it's also important to understand that conflict can also be passive. And that is actually, in many situations, more dangerous than active conflict, because it sort of festers and it lasts a long time and it can do a lot of damage below the surface.
And that's what really gets families stuck, because they're not talking to each other, they're back to back, and they're really just thinking about themselves and what they're trying to accomplish.
So we think of, we like this image of the Jenga tower because it reminds us that the family business system, although it has great advantages, we think it's the best possible business model because of the long-term view and the commitment of stakeholders, but it's also a fragile environment. It's a fragile business system because of the high potential for conflict. And therefore, it's easy to get stuck. And one thing I'll add here, if you think about interdependence as being, the root of the potential for conflict and what gets people stuck, one of the ways that family members seek to manage that is they silo up, thereby artificially reducing interdependence. So one brother or one sibling takes the sales area, one takes production, one takes the back office, for example. And by artificially limiting overlap and communication, et cetera, and sticking to their own silo, well, they can reduce the perception of interdependence. But as you can understand, when you have a siloed organization without a lot of cross-pollination of ideas, the organization becomes stuck, and succession planning becomes virtually impossible.
Doug, if I could just make a note,
Sure.
Sometimes there's the elephant in the room and everyone's aware of it, the proverbial elephant, but sometimes people don't know what other people in the family are thinking. So there might be a fear of moving forward in succession when one person in the family actually does not want to be the successor. And it would be easier if that feeling was just known.
Yeah, and that's the value of a really proactive, purposeful process.
It provides a forum for families to feel safe and really exploring what they think, what they want, trying on different scenarios, and having someone to help them think it through.
But another characteristic that really distinguishes family-business conflict is that it's systemic. It's not dispute. So, we get called into a family and the presenting problem is typically a dispute, or as it's described to us as a dispute. We see it as part of a systemic issue. So, for example, an argument between a father and a daughter over the daughter's salary. Yeah, if you look at that as a dispute, you can find a negotiated solution to that. But then her brother finds out that the sister got a raise, for example, and he knows he's the one who's really making it rain at that company, and man, if she deserves a raise, what about his? Or the brother's wife finds that out and says, your dad has never respected you, and this is the straw that breaks the camel's back. And he's not going to come to our house unless he makes this right, and on and on and on. So with a family business with a lot of interdependence, a lot of stakeholders, a lot of moving parts, you can't approach managing conflict, dispute by dispute, sort of whack-a-mole style. You have to approach it more strategically.
The other thing that makes conflict in family businesses unique is that the nature of family business is really, we call it identity-based. So rather than having a situation that's just like a civil dispute, a neighbor dispute, or just a regular coworker dispute in a non-family firm, conflict in family business is much more akin to political or ethnic or religious conflict, because being a stakeholder in the family business speaks so much to one's identity, one's core values, who he or she is. And so when they look in the mirror and they see themselves as a stakeholder in this family business, they might see the leader of the business, where their cousins may really see something different. So what we find is that there's so much at stake for that individual stakeholder who sees him or herself in a particular light. And when that is threatened, that person will go to all ends to make sure that they protect their identity, their belief system, what's important to them. And they will see their cousins, their siblings, the others who are maybe seeing them differently as real threats to who they are. And that's what really makes so much of conflict in family business really extreme or intractable. So you combine this idea of very interdependent systems, a combination of active or passive conflict, which we've talked about, and this identity-based nature. It basically is saying to you that this role in the family business is so much more than a job. It's much more than just getting a paycheck, and it's not something that you can pick up and leave. No more than a religious person could just leave those beliefs at the door and walk away to something else. It's not going to be negotiable. It's going to be truly core to who that person is. And because of that, it permeates all aspects of their lives and becomes a systemic issue for themselves personally, as well as playing out in the greater system. So you're not dealing, as Doug said, with a series of individual disputes. You're dealing with a systemic conflict that's dealing with a lot of different stakeholders. So you have multiple layers of people who are involved. And because a lot of these people who are involved are family members, as an individual is trying to work out how to, manage a particular conflict, they're not only trying to resolve that substantive issue, whether, it's a salary perhaps, as Doug mentioned, but rather how we're going to stay family going forward in the future. How are these relationships going to remain tenable and strong? So there's an awful lot that's going on, and, the relationships are key.
And that's why you find some conflicts in family business last forever, because the participants, the adversaries in the family business, they're arguing over something substantive. But when they don't see a solution outside of destroying that relationship, they'll remain in battle, maybe forever, because the thought of actually having that relationship destroyed is anathema. That's not an option for many.
And so they remain really entrenched in this really difficult conflict, and it's really, really difficult because what happens is the conflict itself is going to be damaging to the relationships, and the teams are not going to be able to work productively. People change their risk tolerance and their ability to make good judgments because they're so caught up in this really oppressive conflict and the distress. And then, if they can't do that, they're completely unable to make good, timely, productive decisions, and therefore they can't really move forward. And as we all know, businesses need to move forward. Families need to move forward. And if you're paralyzed and can't plan, it's ultimately really a disaster on many, many levels. Certainly on a business level, but certainly for the family as a whole, it keeps everybody on edge. And for the individual, I don't know anybody who's really happy when they're in the midst of a big conflict. So that's a huge impact.
Okay. So we've described why the potential for conflict is so high in family businesses, and we also described, what it looks like, what are its characteristics. But the real important part of our message today is, well, what can you do about it? How do you truly understand it so that you can pick it apart and figure it out, understand all the moving parts, and really move forward with solutions. So we, and this is really the name of our book and really the methodology that we're talking about today. Now, the next slide has a lot of builds, which will all happen pretty quickly, I would guess.
So we're just going to give you all the components all at once.
So let me explain that in reverse, unfortunately. So the feeding the flames of active conflict. All conflict, active or passive, all conflict has three underlying reasons for those conflicts. And those are people have opposing goals, not just different goals, but goals that can't be achieved simultaneously. They have incompatible values. Again, not just different values, but values that really clash with each other. And as we all know, when family works together, they bring along a lot of baggage. They bring along a lot of history, and very often that history is difficult history. And that plays out in the workplace.
Could you give some examples? All those... I'm sorry, could you give some examples?
So incompatible values, it's a good question. Incompatible values might be risk tolerance or work ethic. And let's take risk tolerance for a minute. We worked with a family that two brothers running a large restaurant chain. One wanted to continue expanding and take great risks to go out of state. The other brother was very risk averse. And it was very difficult for him to sign on to these reinvestment for growth plans.
We have a lot of families where they've learned, through their upbringing that debt is terrible. You should never be in debt. You should just be able to pay for everything you do. And then others might go to business school and say, actually, a little bit of leverage can go a long way and make us significantly more profitable. So that value regarding regarding debt tolerance is something that's a value that's deeply held, and it's very difficult to get somebody to move from that spot. So, the opposing goals of growth versus staying small, you can't do both at the same time. They're mutually exclusive. The incompatible values of risk tolerance is a good example, or even political parties. We have, some Republicans and Democrats who find it really difficult to be in the same room. And how do they make decisions together when they have complete disdain for each other's values?
So when you have a system where that you have not only different, but opposing goals when compared to your cousin or sibling or whatever, or parent, You know that there are opposing goals embedded in your relationship. You know that there are incompatible values. You know that there's a difficult history. So what do people do? They walk on eggshells. That is the recipe for being stuck.
Passive conflict.
Yes. To have active conflict requires something else. It requires a trigger. And that trigger is what we call disrespected power. That's when power is exerted from one party over another in a way that the target of that power disrespects. So, for example, if my brother is the president of the company and I'm the head of marketing, I submit my yearly marketing plan and my brother doesn't like it, tells me to redo it. Well, if I think that my brother has the moral authority of that position, he went to the right schools, he's been involved with the company his whole life, he has the respect of the employees, the vendors, the distributors, etc., well, I'm not going to blow up the system because he doesn't like my marketing plan. I may think it's a great marketing plan, and I may think I need to work at another company that respects how I do my work, but I'm not going to blow it up. However, if I feel that my brother doesn't have the moral authority of that seat, for example, he got the presidency because he was mom's favorite, or he just got there first. If I don't respect the position of authority, I'm going to start getting allies. I'm going to start saying, no, I know better than you, and the fact that you have power over me, I don't accept that. And that's going to trigger active conflict. And also, if the brother may have the moral authority of that office, but tells me in front of my peers, in front of the board, in front of my other family members how terrible my plan was, the way he exerts power over me is also a trigger, an example of disrespected power.
So when we work with families, it's important for us to think through who holds power and how do they use it. And a lot of us think about an org chart, and some companies have org charts, some companies don't have org charts. But certainly for the ones who do, generally we think of org charts as a way to understand lines of reporting, lines of authority, and who is subordinate to whom. But in a family business, a simple org chart isn't always as effective as that or as clear as that, because if you look at the org chart in the context of who are the family members, then you start thinking about perhaps some of those family members who may be in a subordinate role on the org chart may have more power over some who appear superior. And then there are often other folks, in-laws sometimes, or perhaps a grandparent who was working in the business years before who have moral authority, who are not on the org chart at all, but hold significant power in that family business system. Those voices have to be heard. They must have a place at the table, because as you're trying to work through a succession plan or a new governance structure, those people wield considerable power, and many of them have really great experience and are very smart and have a lot to add as well. But they have a lot of power and need to have their voice heard. Power is also held in families in a variety of other ways, which can be shareholder agreements or contracts that have been signed, who holds the purse strings, who holds the moral authority. These are other areas where power is really held and has to be looked at. And it's not to say that other people don't have power, because, frankly, everybody has some sort of power. Nobody is completely powerless. And so the question is, who holds it, how do they use it, and what is the best way to move the system forward? So if you're looking at contracts, you may be able to vote somebody out because you have majority control. But if you look down the line into the future, the effect of that vote may not be, really getting you what you want to get. So, again, just to wrap up the components of the methodology that we're looking at, we think about the potential for conflict, and so it's important for us to always be understanding what roles each individual plays and how interdependent the system is. We want to understand everybody's goals, their values, and their historical impasses. What is the baggage they're bringing with them? Because that will really affect how they interact and how they make decisions. And then, as I said before, we're looking to understand power, who holds it, and how it's used. And that's one of the most important ways that we look at this, but there's an additional factor that's critical.
So we talked about those components of conflict, and we're going to present one more. Now, in our book, we talk about 12 components of conflict and its management. So I think this is the sixth one I think we're going to present. And it's called the family factor, and it's the answer to this question. Is the family bond strong enough to leverage compromise and a commitment to change? From our perspective, this is the thing we have to find out first and foremost when working with a family, because it tells us how likely, how invested this family is going to be in finding solution to conflict. So we break this down into three sort of components, and that is there a shared history? Is there an important shared history? Does this family have a deep shared history with each other? Do they go on vacations together? Do they really know each other very well and have shared experience historically? Because if they do, then they have something to lose if they don't find a solution to their conflict. Likewise, if they have a strong shared vision of the future, of being family together for the future, they would have something to gain by compromising and committing to change and making the effort. But if they're just staying together until grandma dies and then they're going to all go their separate ways, then there isn't much to gain by putting a lot of effort and making compromise into finding a solution. And the final component or subcomponent is this idea of trust. Now, most people look at trust and they think about, well, I can trust you if I know our interests are aligned. If you have my back, I can trust you. We look at it a little bit differently. We look at trust as akin to predictability. So if I know you well enough, for example, if I know that my brother is going to stab me in the back every chance he gets, well, in a strange way, I can sort of trust that. And that's really the critical factor. The more stakeholders know each other deeply, and the more they understand the legal agreements that connect them, the business systems that connect them, the other organizational systems that connect them, if they truly understand all of that, then they can predict how the system will behave when they make a decision. And therefore, they can start making decisions beyond their own personal interest and instead for the betterment of the group at large. So that's how trust, viewed a little bit differently, impacts the family factor. And when we start working with a family, that's the first thing we're trying to gauge. What is the current family factor, and can we build it? So sometimes we work with families that have a very difficult shared history. And our job would be to help them create a shared narrative that they can all live with and build upon for the future. Sometimes we have to help them create a vision for the benefits of being family down the road in the future. And we have to build trust. And again, not factional type of trust, but a true trust, which comes from educating folks on what connects them and educating folks about each other and building those shared experiences.
And so when we deal with a family that is in conflict, we have to think about what is the best way to approach managing that conflict. And there are two basic ways that people default when they think about how to manage conflict. And the first is a power-based, and the second is a bargaining-based. So power-based is really wanting to use power to force somebody or some group to do something in your favor. So we think about litigation. We think about arbitration or voting. We think about retaliation as a way that you can, through power, force somebody to do what you want. On a bargaining-based A bargaining-based approach deals more with negotiation or mediation. How do you resolve things in a way? Maybe you split the difference. Maybe you use collaborative law, which is a particular system that's very prevalent in Massachusetts, where we are, and in California as well. If people have questions, we can talk more about collaborative law. So, again, you can force, you can use power, you can bargain to get people to do what you want or try to get them to move. The problem is, and if you think back to, as we were discussing, the reasons for conflict being opposing goals, incompatible values, and historical impasses, force and bargaining will really only address issues of opposing goals, maybe the conflict management process itself or a power imbalance, but basically things related to money and power. That's where you can use force. You can vote somebody out. You can, if you have power, you can make them act in a certain way. But what we find is that in family-owned and operated companies and family enterprises, those opposing goals are not usually the main reasons that they're stuck or that they're in conflict. Incompatible values or historical impasses or even a weak family bond are generally much more likely to be causing the problems that this family is facing. So from that standpoint, if you think about power and bargaining, those are not appropriate approaches to deal with these particular issues. You cannot bargain with somebody to like you. You cannot force somebody to forget what was said or some narrative of the past. You can't, really negotiate with somebody to trust you. Can't just say, well, trust me a little bit. And in terms of just the family bond and family relations, these are not negotiable. And as a result, these things that really create most of the problems within a family business system don't respond. And so when you think about mediation or you think about taking someone to court, generally families lose when those approaches are put into place.
Yeah. So if you can't bargain and you can't force and really move a family business or a family enterprise that's in conflict forward, what can you do? Well, luckily there's a third alternative, which is really what we do and probably what most family business consultants do, although not in this purposeful way to manage conflict. But that third approach to managing conflict is what we call a development-based approach. And the goal is to grow the family, the individuals, the branches, the groups, and its organizations out of conflict. And it's an interdisciplinary process that involves both structural development. So we would look, and structural development is what we call the lower hanging fruit in this process because it's easier to change systems than it is people. But structural development would include coming up with policies, coming up with procedures on how things get done, accountability systems, and other structures, other systems that make the system of working together and owning together less inherently conflictual. That's why building a board of directors is often a good idea. But again, any change in a family business system, because it's so complex and because there's so many areas of interdependence, any change has to be done with great care. Putting in a corporate fiduciary board of directors, for example, may work against the perceived interests of some of the stakeholders who are going to push back. So this idea of putting in good ideas that are so-called best practice because they're best practice, our view is focus on managing conflict. That is the core challenge. And any change you're going to make to the system shouldn't just be because it seems like a good idea. It should be made to attack a specific problem that's leading to conflict. So structural development. And then there's personal development. So if we can make people better at their jobs by coaching, skill development, education, if we can make each stakeholder more empathetic to their fellow stakeholders through discussion, through sharing experiences together, if we could put in a forgiveness process to address historical impasses, we can build trust, if we can build communication, then we can grow this family and its organization out of conflict. So this is a graphic that shows that the core way to manage conflict in a family business is personal and structural development.
And just, building, just to add a little bit more color to the whole concept of development and the kinds of opportunities, when Doug was talking about structural development, building an organizational chart can often help, not only just to clarify what a job description is for an individual, but also an accountability for getting that job done. So when we look at succession planning, for example, and we have a company that is structured in a very loose, relaxed way without clear roles and responsibilities, that's a recipe for conflict because people don't really know what their job is, where their responsibility begins and ends. And so doing something that might sound simple but really is a little more challenging is really crafting the job descriptions and the org chart. Same with exit opportunities. We like there to be exit opportunities for everybody, whether they're in the business or in ownership. We think that it's important for them to have ways that they can get out. And Doug mentioned boards. Boards are not always a great idea. Sometimes you want an advisory board, sometimes, a board of directors. Sometimes that's not needed, but when it is, that's a way that you can manage conflict really through putting in some oversight and accountability. Another issue that we do an awful lot with families is dispute resolution training. Now, I know we said that dispute resolution is not a process that we think is really effective for family businesses, but the skills are very important. And to the extent that we can teach individuals certain dispute resolution skills, give them a common vocabulary, specific frameworks, that can allow them to speak to each other with the same language and be able to sort of nip it in the bud so that they don't end up in a larger problem. And that's something that we often do.
Yes, with good dispute resolution skills, stakeholders can manage disputes as they arise before they become systematized, and that's really the key. So, where are we?
And again, we're happy to talk in the Q&A if you have questions on any of the specific, pieces of that.
So we call our methodology the conflict equation, and we've talked about maybe half a dozen of the components of conflict and its management that we've identified. But we've also taken this to really a different level. It's actually, if this is of interest to you and you read our book, you'll see that we present these characteristics of conflict and its management, these components, as an algebraic expression. And the reason for that is a lot of folks see the value, but they prefer to just talk about each individual component. But the value of presenting it as an equation is because only in an equation format can you really see how each component in real time influences other components. The written word, the lists, they're all sequential. And it's hard to get a really good gut feel of how these moving parts fit together, how they work in the written form or sequential lists. But doing so in an equation is very, very useful. And you'd be surprised, even folks that never thought that they were math geeks or interested in math or that this would not resonate with them, like Blair, really embrace this concept. Once they get familiar with the concepts, it's really, really impactful and can be transformative for families. Okay. So one of the things we want to leave you with is that there's a lot of information out there about what we call best practices. There's a lot of good ideas. But not all those good ideas are right for every family. And just because another family another successful family did X, Y, or Z best practice doesn't mean that's the best practice for your family business. What's important for your family business is to really dig deep, figure out where you get stuck, where conflict develops, and put in processes and developmental initiatives that speak directly to those problems. So the way we look at this, your family business has to be connected by good ideas, good agreements, good communication, good having a business plan. All these things are really good ideas. But what connects these things is a robust conflict management process and awareness. It's the mortar that keeps the family business strong.
So with that, we'd like to sort of end this part of the webinar and leave it open now for questions.
Okay, I have several questions from the audience to start with. One goes back to this, with fairness always being problematic. Can you talk a little bit about geographical distance among second-generation siblings and the lopsided responsibilities that may come from that, especially if there's no interest by third-generation members of the family? Any ideas how to shore up, I guess, geographical inequities that can create problems?
Well, I think, in our world today, youngsters grow up and they go off and they move elsewhere, and they might not want to stay in the town where they grew up and work in the factory or work on the farm, and they want to go to the city and they want to get that investment banking job instead. And so families really are much more mobile and move around. So to a degree, you could say the ones who stay may be more likely to get a lucrative job in the family business, but that's often a choice. That said, if the parent has moved away, that next generation cousin doesn't necessarily have the same opportunities for a summer job or an after-school job, and so there's an inequity there. I think that's sort of part of the deal. That's just what happens, and it's not really that equal is fair or fair is equal. We actually say that fair is a four-letter word. It's kind of a non-starter in families. But we see a lot of geographic problem when it comes to sharing vacation homes. That's an area where we deal with a lot of families, because the ones who are close by and can use that beach house every weekend get a lot more bang for their buck if they're paying for the taxes and maintenance as a shared cost than those who live across the country and need an airplane ticket to come. So the geographic dispersion can affect families in a variety of different ways. It certainly affects how well, children know their grandparents and how well certain cousins know each other better. And
and what we think is helpful is to be aware of the identity at play. That summer home might be very, very, very meaningful to the eldest child that pretty much grew up in that house but now lives across the country. And to begin to use the components of conflict that we talked about today to get a deeper understanding of what's really going on, because when you get that deeper understanding, ideas for managing that conflict, new ideas and deeper ideas and more effective ideas will come up, will arise.
We also, just one more point about the geographic dispersion, we see that being problematic with shared philanthropy. When families share a foundation or other resources that they give charitably, they generally want to give in their communities. They want to support their local museum or their local opera company or symphony, rather than in the old hometown where they have no real connection anymore. So that's something that we recognize as a unintended consequence of some of the geographic dispersion.
Yeah. So we hope, if anything, this conversation we've had today will give you a broader vocabulary to discuss what's really going on.
Okay, another question. You addressed this a little bit, but it's pretty specific. How do you overcome distrust among family members in order to solve conflict?
So first of all, think about trust as predictability. not respect. People are people. People have different values. They get along differently with different family members, different non-family members. To build trust, you have to know people well, and you have to be somewhat non-judgmental and understand, try and see from their eyes what the system looks like from their position.
We also look at it when we take into consideration a few factors that go into that knowing a person well, is being able to evaluate if they are really capable of doing what they say they're going to do. So we want to know, I say that I'm going to do X for you. You need to evaluate, do I have the confidence to do that? And then you also need to look at what's at stake. If you have very little at stake, you might take a chance and trust me with something. You think, well, she's probably able to do this. So, and if she screws up, it'll be okay because it's not really that important. You can begin to build trust with, sort of bite-sized steps, or I guess I should say baby steps, so that you do little trials over time where you first test is the person capable of doing it, and you put them in charge of things where there's not a whole lot at stake.
There's a framework called the 4 C's of trust, the 4 C's, the letter C. You're catching me a little bit off guard here. I don't know if I can rattle them off, but you want to communicate what it is you want that other person to do, right? You want to make sure that they have the competence to do that, whatever it is. You want to make sure that they approach it with care, the care that you expect. And there's a 4th C that I can't grab right now, but you can Google it. It's a common framework, and that might give you a different perspective in how you would approach that conversation about trust.
Okay. Another question. How do you figure out or identify where conflicts really are within the family? I mean, sometimes it's very obvious, but if there's a sense of conflict without sort of obvious fires, what strategies to bring conflict to at least figure out where the conflict is?
I think it's a process where you really need a neutral person involved, somebody who really doesn't have a stake in the outcome, who can gain the trust of each of the individuals to really unpack what's going on for each of them. If you think through, from the first image that we gave you of that bullseye, where you have the individual people who are really at the center, the core of that family business system. And you want to understand what are their goals, what are their values, what are the commonalities that they share, where are the landmines, and you can understand that and put that in the context of the resources that are available and how do you help the system be able to maximize their opportunities and minimize their risks. So, those are the kinds of things where you see if there's conflict. And thinking about conflict as being a passive form of conflict, not just active, there's so much that's really under the surface that it really takes some digging to really understand the nature of it. Oftentimes people will just feel stuck. They just feel uncomfortable moving around in a situation, or a next generation member doesn't really know how they can enter into the business because there's no articulated career path. That doesn't look like conflict, but it's really a potential for conflict, and that's something that has to be brought out and discussed, and it might come with some difficult needs for structure and accountability that the senior generation isn't used to having or doesn't want. But these are the kinds of things that prevent the system from moving forward and making decisions. And I think it really takes some eyes from the outside to come in and really evaluate and assess what's happening.
Yeah.
Okay. Another question, and there are many, and Barbara, I'll shift over to you for yours as well. But how do you handle the conflict that comes from, how do you handle the inequity in voting shares and relative leverage between the powerful family shareholders and maybe those who are less powerful? How do you balance that representation of the entire family in deconstructing conflict?
So one of the things we teach is that voting is a last resort. Voting is a way to use power to achieve what you want. Voting is power, and it's not fun to be on the losing side of a vote. And people have long memories because these are continuing relationships that will last generations.
And that becomes a historical impact.
Right. A bad vote that really memorializes something that one branch or one faction feels is an inequity, that's going to be tomorrow's historical impasse. So one of the things we teach is that in the boardroom, you should strive for a consensus-building process rather than a vote. Now, some things, of course, have to go to vote. That's clear. But minimize that so that the power of the vote sort of is the afterthought. But the consensus build, the commitment to going through a consensus-building approach, and Blair can tell you, what that really entails, the commitment to do the heavy lifting of a consensus-building approach is what keeps families together through difficult decisions.
Yeah, I'd add to that if you can get an aligned vision so that people are all trying to go in the same direction, it's much easier to get consensus. If you have different visions, frankly, you're going to have a pretty difficult time running a business together. But, speaking about consensus building on a very simplistic level, what you're trying to do is you're trying to find out is whatever option that's on the table something that could be turned into something that would be acceptable to all. So you're not trying to get everyone to say that X or Y solution is the best possible solution they could have ever thought of, but rather that they can live with it. And we use that as a minimum standard. We talk about it as getting above the line of can you live with it. And what we do is we put the responsibility on the shareholders who are saying this is not okay to transforming the option into something. What would have to change for this option to be acceptable? What would have to change for you to be able to live with it? Now, if that turns it into something that somebody else can't live with, the process has to continue. It's not just a one-shot deal. There can be many, many iterations. And as Doug said, it can take an awful long time, and you need to have some patience. But ultimately, it's a much better way to make decisions because, as Doug mentioned, if you're the loser in the vote, losers generally come back for another bite at the apple, and that's not what families are looking for.
And there's a chapter on this in our book on consensus building. We have a couple more minutes. Any more questions?
Right. I wanted to note to you, Doug, that one of our listeners noted that the fourth C in your 4 C's of trust is consistent.
Yes, consensus, predictability. That was...
Exactly.
P with predictability, but that's exactly right. Yeah. Thank you very much to whomever that was.
Okay. And Barbara, over to you for a final question and a close.
Okay. One of my questions is the process of creating an org chart. I would imagine that in some cases that would be a very eye-opening experience, especially if the family hasn't sat down to do that.
Yeah. So in a family business in its early stages, they're typically very flat, patriarch or matriarch, all the lines lead there. With more sophistication, with more, professional development, you do develop a more robust org chart with clearer lines of authority, clearer lines of accountability.
But we don't go into it assuming that there is one correct org chart. We develop org charts that really are consistent with what the individual stakeholders want, what their skill sets are, and what the organization is trying to achieve. So we look at it from a business standpoint, and we have MBAs. We've run businesses before, so we know how businesses are structured and what works and what doesn't work. And we take that knowledge and we overlay that onto what are the interests of the shareholders and how do they want their company to be run.
So, for example, we work with one family that has 3 essentially co-presidents. They call them co-managers. You'd never submit that as an option in a non-family company. It's not your ideal structure, but for this family business, that's what they need. That's what, and we put in the structures. We do the structural development to make that structure successful.
As long as it works for them, it works, right?
That's the point.
Right. So thank you very much, Doug and Blair, for your insights on how families can get themselves out of conflict by acquiring the skills to understand and manage it. I want to tell the audience that the replay of the webinar will be available for all participants to listen to at your convenience, and the supporting materials will be sent to you so that you can follow up. And also I'd like to add that Doug and Blair would be happy to have audience members contact them either by email or by phone for more information.
Terrific.
Now, on behalf of Continuity Family Business Consulting and Family Business Magazine, I'd like to thank our listeners for joining our webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks very much.